Hi, here's another example of an article presentation. Your assigned article this week was by Forres and Gans, Effectiveness of Direct Instruction for Teaching Statement Interference, Use of Facts, Analogies to Students with Developmental Disabilities and Reading Delays. Some students who are able to decode and read fluently remain unable to comprehend text. Oral language skills possibly contribute to deficits in reading comprehension. These are the theoretical underpinnings of this study. They wanted to look at, or the authors wanted to look at, direct instruction because it has proven to improve reading comprehension for those at risk for failure across many areas of disability, ability level, and grade level. The purpose of this study was to examine the extent to which a DI program could be implemented with students with autism spectrum disorder, developmental delays, and reading delays. And they wanted to test that effectiveness of the DI on reading comprehension skills, which included the components of capital D, capital I. That means it's a established curriculum called direct instruction, statement inference, using facts, and analogies. So let's move on to the methods of this research. Beginning with the participants, there were 4 participants, 3 females and 1 male. They were all between the ages of 10 and 14 in what was considered a middle school. Now let's look specifically at their pre-baseline levels of word identification versus comprehension, because that is going to lead us to understand what type of student may respond better to DI instruction in these areas. So Chris had a 98 standard score on word identification, which is quite average, but his comprehension was 3 standard deviations below the mean, very significantly below average. Haley had a low end of average word identification standard score, and her comprehension was indeed below average, but right on the line. Jean, a little different from the previous 2, had below average word ID and was scoring barely no comprehension. And then lastly, Sarah had a low average word ID with a comparable standard score on comprehension. So her word ID and comprehension were about the same. So we had 2 students with very discrepant average word ID, low comprehension, one with low both ID and comprehension, and another that's just in the low range, at risk for both. All right, this was in a private school for students with autism spectrum disorder and developmental disabilities. It was a DI program, Big D, Big I, which is called Corrective Reading, Thinking Basics, and they picked 3 of the domains there: statement inference, using facts and analogies. And it was implemented per the manual. This is a highly structured curriculum and requires a lot of fidelity. So let's check out the general procedures here. They used direct instruction with the curriculum, which included the teacher following a given script to present the information and students responding with a choral response. Teacher used a clear signal to elicit student responses and provided correction procedures for incorrect answers per the curriculum manual. And providing the correction procedures for incorrect or responses, if they were not in unison, they used modeling skills. They guided student responses, asked students to respond independently. And during baseline, the data were collected until each student had a minimum of 3 consecutive stated data points. And during intervention, there was an instruction daily. Each strand of the direct instruction was implemented one at a time until the student reached a preset criterion, which is required for a multiple baseline or a multiple probe design. That was 3 consecutive days at 100%, and that was the indicator to move to a new tier within the design. Those probes were administered individually prior to each instruction of the day. So the lesson would start with a probe. So they would give them collect their data. Then they would provide instruction. And the next day they would collect data and provide instruction. So that was the order. It wasn't instruction and then immediately, because that might indicate like that immediate recall or ability, but by collecting the data first, it would show that more generalized maintained improvement. All right, in terms of reliability, which is very important to the internal validity of the study, they use point-by-point agreement across 60% of the probes or data points, and they got 98% accuracy on the data. So in terms of fidelity or the treatment reliability, they use a checklist of behaviors. 1 day a week, a second observer would observe the teacher and identify if he or she was following the direct instruction teaching procedures. And there was 100% accuracy on that fidelity or treatment reliability. So they measured the progress and examined a functional relation between the percent correct and the DI instruction using a multiple probe across behaviors. And remember, multiple probe just means that they're the frequency of probes during baseline. It's not continuous. So we can look at this first graph, and you can see this is a multiple probe across behaviors design. Then we have the 3 different behaviors, the statement inference behavior, using facts behavior, and the analogies. It's been done across each of the 4 students. When baseline data were stable, instruction on each DI strand was put in place. So we have stable baseline data across each of the 3 tiers. It was put in place for statement inference for the first behavior, and once it met that preset criterion of 3 consecutive sessions at 100%, it began with the next. Assuming that, not assuming, but noting that the baseline data had remained low and only changed upon introduction of the intervention on each subsequent behavior or tier. And again, for analogies. So here we have another student. This is Haley. Haley, again, had low, stable baseline data, and only upon introduction of the intervention for that behavior did we see an immediate abrupt change in level and trend, and it met the preset criterion before moving on to the next skill or strand in the DI. So we see 3 replications of effect there. So we can eliminate threats to internal validity such as maturation or historical confounding because we see the behavior change and 3 replications of effect only at the point of introduction of the intervention. We have reliability data on both the data collection and the treatment. And because we have 4 students, we have that inter-subject direct replication that extends our external validity. And it also allows us to not have attrition as a threat to internal validity. So all 4 students met the criterion across 3 strands of DI under the time-lagged introduction of each strand. So this provides us with the functional relation between instruction and reading comprehension improvement. The only modifications were visual cues during the using facts condition to accommodate for poor oral comprehension. Some limitations to this study would include that there's no comparison across other reading programs to know if it's more or less effective than other options. Some teachers don't like the scripted nature of the corrective reading or big capital D, capital I. We need systematic replications to increase the external validity because this was limited to a private school and only 4 students with varied ability were represented. It's also noted that only 3 strands of the direct instruction were provided, and the corrective reading has more strands than that. And there was no evaluation of social validity in this study. It wasn't even implemented by a teacher. So this is a difficult curriculum to implement, and it would be interesting to see how a teacher might implement with fidelity. So thank you for your attention on my presentation. I hope it helps.